imagine the future. Albert Einstein said that imagination is more important than knowledge. You should know. You know, through the centuries, the inventions of all great men and women began as an idea in their imagination. So if we want a better future, we must first imagine a better future, one that is good for the people, one that is good for the planet, and then work on it to make it happen. Is this possible? Can we do this? Let's find out. Welcome. Welcome to the 10th edition of Global Outlook on Bridging a Fragmented World. And this is brought to you by our sponsors, IDA Cluster, GCE Norde, GARD, Arendalsuka Company, and University of Agder. My name is Anita, and I'm today's moderator. First, some safety instructions. In case of an emergency, please exit through the 2 doors at the back and the 2 doors in the front. And please send in your questions to all our panelists and speakers using the Menti app. So you see, the login details are given here, menti.com, and the conference code for Global Outlook Conference is 54614336. You can send in your questions right through the conference. So great progress comes when great minds imagine big. Most of us, our imagination, not so big. It's like what the car maker Henry Ford said. If he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So thinking big, thinking creatively brings great progress. But over the last few years, some of our problems have become worse. We live in a fragmented world, divided people living on a damaged planet. Damaged because of our own activities. So we've gone through the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, worsening inequality, rising geopolitical tensions, climate crisis. We've experienced all this. We read and write and talk about it. There is so much noise that sometimes we miss the signals of hope, the signals that there are men and women out there in different parts of the world trying to solve these problems. Men and women who dare to imagine a better future for all of us. And they include our speakers today. They have come from Oslo, from Brussels, from Stockholm, from New Delhi, from Kyiv, Ukraine, and they will share their experiences and their insights with you. And this is the power of Global Outlook. Year after year, for 10 years, Global Outlook has been bringing to Arendal experts from different parts of the world. They are brought here and they connect. They connect with the hope of creating a better world, doing what little they can to create a better world. Some of them can do a lot, as we have seen over the years and as you will see today. So we begin in Norway, the small country with a big global footprint. Norway's Foreign Minister, Anniken Huitfeldt, will talk to us on Bridging a Fragmented World, the view from Norway. Please welcome the Foreign Minister.
Thank you so much, Anita. And I'm so delighted to be back at Global Outlook here in Arendal. Almost 130 years ago, one summer day, like this maybe, at Voie farm, which is not very far from here, a local girl took lunch to her father, a farmer who was plowing the fields. The girl noticed then a silver ring that had got stuck in the plow. She had, in fact, stumbled upon a treasure from the Viking Age. It was composed of silver bangles and coins from different places in today's Russia, Uzbekistan, Iran, and also Afghanistan. The silver fragment created a bridge to a distant past, with vast connections to the outside world. Today, they are on display at Arendalsuka Museum. And as Minister of Culture, I was so proud to take the decision to build the new museum, or the new building, which contains this interesting, very, very interesting, I would say, exhibition. So you can take my word for it. Cubans' many treasures are worth visit. Not least the silver fragments from Voie Store. We know now that the Viking Age was a time of cultural and commercial expansion, a time of huge changes. Today, we live in a period of change as well. We have seen decades of increasing interconnectedness and steady economic growth in many parts of the world. Now, however, the future direction seems uncertain. We can get the sense that many countries are turning inward rather than opening up. Or, as you have described it, that the world is more fragmented. Key players in the international system are deeply suspicious of each other. There are different views on what the world order will and should look like. This uncertainty is, in itself, destabilizing. Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine has added to our sense of unpredictability. We sometimes forget that wars of conquest used to be a principal means of conducting foreign policy. Between 1816 and 1948, one state disappeared on average every 3 years. But this changed after the Second World War. In the entire post-war era, the world was largely free of such wars of conquest. But Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine broke that norm. It had been more than 30 years with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait since one country tried to remove another country from the map. Russia's war has brought back the menace of nuclear weapons. Its consequences have worsened the negative economic spiral we saw under COVID-19. It has revealed vulnerabilities in global supply chains. It comes on top of an already high number of unresolved conflicts and accelerating climate change. All of this has reversed decades of development progress. Millions have been forced to flee their homes. 360 million people worldwide need humanitarian assistance, up 30% since the start of last year alone. These challenges are interconnected. They compound each other. Norway has a small and also an open economy, so further polarization is not in our interest. How do we best navigate in this landscape? Firstly, we must prevent a return to protectionism. In a time of increased strategic competition, we must protect critical infrastructure and screen foreign investments. China's rise is a part of that picture, but this is true for all countries and also regions. De-risking strategic value chains is important for our security. My point is that those efforts need to be based on threat analysis. Some areas need to be closely fenced in, such as critical infrastructure, others do not. If we use security as a pretext for protectionism, we all stand to lose. According to the European Union's Climate Monitoring Service, the planet just had its hottest June on record. This summer, new heat records were also set in the Arctic. For the first time, the average monthly temperature on Svalbard in July was recorded at above 10 degrees Celsius. Nowhere else in the world is experiencing such a rapid rise in the temperatures as Svalbard. This has dramatic implications, not only in the Arctic, but for the entire world. All this to say, the green transition is not a choice, it is an imperative, which is simply not possible without investments, cooperation, and trade. Global trade, regulated through an international, predictable framework, that is how we reduce uncertainty. Trade in global merchandise actually hit record level in 2022. In other words, we are still very, very interconnected. And according to United States Department of Commerce, total trade between United States and China reached an all-time high last year, 24% higher than pre-COVID. So global trade in gross figures do not reflect the growing geopolitical rivalry yet. The Director General of the World Trade Organization is a very, very strong economist from Nigeria. As she recently put it, we need not to de-globalize, we must re-globalize. So focusing on deeper and also more diversified global supply chains, I agree with her. Everyone stands to lose from trade wars. This includes the United States and also China. In Arendal, we certainly know how international trade is especially important for a small country like Norway. Secondly, we must bridge the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. Sometimes healthy competition means that you end up on the losing end, especially if you can't keep up with the pace of innovation. This city knows a thing or two about that. The Viking treasure at Voie was found during a period of deep economic crisis for Arendal. The declining demand for sailing ships due to the development of steamers was a part of that story. Today, new technologies hold huge potential to improve people's lives. And to make the greener transition possible, green shipping has a huge potential here in Norway. And Arendal is today the home of some of Norway's most innovative companies and research centers, like Gard, who is involved in ensuring an incredible 50% of the global merchant fleet, like the Eide cluster, who play a pivotal role in the development of Norway's national battery industry. The world needs both more energy and more renewable energy. These are reinforcing goals. And last year, investments in renewable energy systems by far exceeded investments in the petroleum industry. In their quest for energy, the very last thing states want is to be a part of the mercy of unpredictable authoritarian leaders. Norway has become Europe's most important energy producer, and we are doing our part to ensure stability of supply, while at the same time reshaping our energy system. Not long ago, the International Energy Agency revised their forecast for renewable capacity additions in the EU for this and next year. They revised it upwards by 40% compared with before the war in Ukraine. Only a few years back, such a rapid increase seemed impossible. This clearly shows how Russia's aggression has increased the pace of the green transition in Europe, and that we should not underestimate the speed of change. Thirdly, we must build global trust. The war has also highlighted this. A clear majority of states agree that their interests are best served by respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peaceful resolution of disputes. Still, many lower and middle-income countries voice frustration with the international order built while they were under colonial rule, and where their influence often do not reflect their demographic size. We need and should call for a minimum of strategic understanding between United States and China. If not, the global system will remain unpredictable. And we need to do a better job at ensuring that the institutions we do have work for all. Finding common solutions is difficult, but it can be done. Following intense negotiations over several years, agreement was reached this spring on a high seas treaty. It will pave the way for closer cooperation to improve ocean health. And a few months ago, a group of governmental experts on nuclear disarmament verification, chaired by a Norwegian diplomat, agreed on important elements for verification. Verification is extremely important because only through verification we can trust the armed control regimes that we need to protect. So even in this tense, I would say, security policy context, it was possible to find convergence on nuclear disarmament issues. These two wins show that working across regional and geopolitical divided lines produces results. My fourth and also final point, we must invest in dialogue and development. An important principle of Norwegian foreign policy is that we speak with everyone. It would, in a sense, be an easy way out to refuse to engage with those that we disagree strongly with. While it would be easy, I'm convinced that it would not be very efficient. As a foreign minister, it would probably mean that I would have less and less counterparts to talk to. To me, defining freedom of expression by boycotting dialogue is a contradiction in terms. So we will continue to stand up for democracy, human rights, and gender equality. We will call out those who abuse power. The uncertainty about the future of international order I described earlier also impacts global conflict patterns. In more and more conflicts, regional powers compete for influence. This outside involvement contributes to fueling and also prolonging conflicts. According to the International Rescue Committee, wars now last, on average, twice as long as they did 20 years ago, and 4 times longer than they did during the Cold War. Protracted conflicts are not easier to solve. They are, in fact, much harder to solve. That is why Norway will continue to invest in mediation and conflict resolution. Friends, I started with a Viking treasure. Here in southern Norway, there is another treasure hidden in the ground. Minerals that can play a critical role in achieving the green transition. And 2 months ago, we pledged to develop the world's most sustainable mineral industry. Part of what made it interesting to live precisely in this period of history is that solving the big challenges of our time is actually possible. Thank you so much.
It is said that the greatest country on earth is... No one? I know many of you thought Norway. But we'll start again. The greatest country on earth, it is said, is the Earth. And here we are, entering a new geological age, crossing the planet's boundaries, destroying its capacity to support life. Our next speaker is Sandrine Dixon de Cleve. She is the co-president of the Club of Rome, the prestigious think tank devoted to global issues. 50 years ago, that is half a century ago, the Club of Rome came out with a prophetic report called Limits to Growth. Many of you would have read that. It predicted exactly the problems that we are facing today. So what does this mean? Is the human race destined to collapse? Or can we avoid that fate by making some right choices? Sandrine says the choice is very clear. It's break down or break through. It's either keep doing this too little too late or take a great leap forward. But how do we take collective action in a fragmented world? Here's Sandrine, and she's going to talk to us about Earth for All, how to achieve well-being for all within the planet's boundaries. Sandrine, and please send questions to Sandrine through the Menti app, 5461-4336, menti.com. We will take it as soon as she finishes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anita. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to be here, truly, and to bring to you, after these two esteemed women have spoken about the challenges of our time, what is before us, the wake-up call. The wake-up call for the future that we want, that is here today, because this is the 21st century, and we need to think in a very different way. We have reached the tipping points. We know full well that we are in a period of what we call the 3 Cs. We've just gone through COVID. We are in the midst of conflict in many countries, one which is right on our doorstep, and we obviously are living climate change, all of us. These 3 Cs are dictating the way in which we need to look at the economic reset. Some of our countries have rethought their economies. Some of our countries have put aside the budgets that are necessary for the recovery and the next steps. But we also know that we've just lived the greatest value disruption, both through the Ukrainian invasion and COVID, that we've ever seen. We are as vulnerable as the most vulnerable link. And we also have created the greatest energy poverty that Europe has ever seen. In a country here in Norway, where you know that you have the greatest resources before you, we have to talk honestly around stranded assets, and whether we continue to invest in oil and gas, or we take the leap of faith that is necessary to reduce our emissions and move towards renewables. It is time now to think through these very grave decisions. And yes, it is difficult, because on top of that, we have multilateralism on the test bench, which the minister has just talked to us about, the relationship between China and the United States, the way in which we actually thought we were moving together again through climate change discussions, and now we're moving apart again because of the Ukrainian invasion. And what does that do to the rest of the world in the way in which we engage with those countries in the South, and the responsibility that Europe has to think through its post-colonial relationship? Not to mention the relationship that we have with the Middle East and the petrostates. We also need to think through, what are people telling us? People who are fed up, whether it be the youth in terms of climate change and the climate activism, whether it be Black Lives Matter, whether it be the calls for more diversity, whether it be the calls for a very different world at a time when many people are suffering, even if we ourselves think that we are not. Because again, people, we are as vulnerable as the most vulnerable link. There is a paradigm change in European politics, but as we come up to the European elections, we need to think hard about what we want. And it is true that we cannot go towards protectionism, as the minister has indicated, nor can we move towards populism, because democracy is sacred. And we know what happens when we lose democracy. And that's what this festival is all about, and that's what we need to talk about. WEF talks about it. The World Economic Forum, it talks about the greatest risks. And what does it show us? It shows us that the greatest risks are not necessarily business risks that you would automatically think about. It is social tipping points combined with environmental tipping points. Those are the greatest risks to our economy, and we must think through them. These big dots that you see here on this graph are the ones that show state collapse, the ones that show the erosion of social cohesion. And it is those tipping points that are our greatest demise. Those tipping points are often linked to the consumption impact, something that we don't talk about. But as Anita says, already in 1972, our report from the Club of Rome showed so clearly the way in which we engage with natural resources and deplete these resources will be our greatest existential risk. So we have to think through that inequality. We have to think through also that it is the wealthiest countries that are creating the climate impact, and yet it is the most vulnerable countries that are feeling that impact head on. Although here in Norway, all of a sudden, lo and behold, climate change is on your doorstep. So what do we need to talk about? Transformational economics for the 21st century. Moving away from an extractive economy, accounting for social and environmental risk in the financial and economic decision-making, thinking through expanding our perspective of public goods, socializing the rewards of doing the right thing, environmental and social commons that are part of our accounting system, which means a shift from just productivity and the way in which we measure GDP. Correcting the inequity between the high and the low-income countries created by international finance, and thinking through the role of women across the globe. Women in decision-making, but also access to education, because that will have a direct impact on population growth in some of those countries that truly do need to shift towards a very different types of economy and a very different type of relationship with natural resources. All of us working together to create what we wanted to see already 50 years ago in the limits to growth, a realization that actually we can work together towards an Earth for all. And so here, as we've now shifted from the reality check, can we move into the imagination? The imagination that shows us that actually it's not that difficult. If we can get away from what I call the 3 Ps, power, the moving away from the arrogance of most people into a government and citizens that are working together away from patriarchy towards people, planet, and prosperity. That is the goal that we tried to bring forward in Earth for All, using our system dynamic modeling when we looked at all of the interconnections, just like the World Economic Forum is looking at now, and the systems approach of where could we start to see the real shifts, where could we see the juxtaposition of shifting from the tipping points towards the actual solutions. And many of those solutions we already have. I do not believe in the American way, which is that technology is going to solve all of our problems. Let's be real, people. We have most of the technology that we need. What we need is to think through, how do we put in place good governance? How do we look at the key elephant in the room, inequity and poverty? Because when you start to unpack those 2 elements, you start to see that actually you can truly create a giant leap scenario. And you move away from what it is that we call the too little, too late, which is today's scenario. Often this obsession with technology as if it's going to solve all of our problems. Because the fact of the matter is global well-being is declining, even in the wealthiest countries. I grew up in San Francisco. If anyone has been to San Francisco, raise your hand recently. What do you think? Did you see those heroin needles that I saw? Did you see that San Francisco is now being called Poop Town? That used to be Calcutta. Now that's San Francisco. This is where all of the so-called American dream was being created, with all of the incredible digitalization and the new products that we see before us, and yet none of them had the actual impact of creating better well-being for most people. It did, however, create great windfall profits for certain companies who are now able to put up foundations in order to make themselves feel better. So the fact of the matter is this: we can do it. But we have to be real. And reality sometimes is painful. But we do have 5 extraordinary turnarounds. And these 5 extraordinary turnarounds means that you focus on transforming and accelerating human development in low-income countries. Because again, we are as vulnerable as the most vulnerable link. And let's remember, those materials that actually the minister just spoke about are mostly in the South. And we are fully dependent on most of those materials. We have to transform wealth distribution, and I know the debate that has happened here in Norway around the wealthiest getting taxed. But the fact of the matter is that if you even have Warren Buffett, who says it's about time that we pay our taxes, or a new organization in the United States called Patriotic Millionaires, you know that there are some of those billionaires who understand the reality of the fact that they are paying way under what they are actually due in terms of taxes. But it's not only taxing people, it's also windfall profits from some of the multinationals who are making so much money, especially the oil and gas industry, on the back of oil poverty and energy poverty across Europe. We have to empower women, as I indicated, but we also have to fully transform our energy systems at a time when we need to talk about a just transition and think through what that means also in terms of the food system, moving towards a regenerative food system. So global poverty would actually dramatically decrease under our giant leap scenario. Look at the difference here in this particular graph between the giant leap and the too little, too late. The way that by 2050, we can actually severely reduce by half global poverty that we actually have in front of us. And that is predominantly by looking at the way in which we look at debt, looking at debt cancellations or debt swaps, special drawing rights, rethinking the institutional finance systems that we have, and shifting away, in particular when we talk about inequality, towards an economy that works for people, an economy that services people, planet, and prosperity. The over-financialization of our economy today is our demise. Europe's economy is 98% dependent on small and medium-sized enterprises, and yet we continuously only think about the 2%. Europe's economy is no longer servicing people because actually it is determined by shareholder value. If your shares continue to go up, you're satisfied, but you can actually fire 10,000 people, and somehow the stock market looks at that as actually a potential positive impact on your share. There is a problem when we don't take into consideration the real impact on people. That is why inequality is so important. That is why we need to think through those social tipping points, because inequality reduces trust. And as the minister said, trust between countries, trust between people is fundamental. Trust in the government is so important. The minute that the trust starts to erode, you then have a negative critical feedback loop. And what we have tried to do within Earth for All is to think through, okay, so how do we actually look at the way in which we decrease social tension? How do we actually look at possibilities in increasing public action? How do we think through the effective way in which a state can be authoritative, not authoritarian? Because through COVID, we saw the transformation. Those countries that were able to immediately react to COVID and speak to its people are the ones that did the best through COVID. Is that an authoritarian state? Is a government that takes the responsibility for all of its people an authoritarian state? No, that is an egalitarian state, very much like the system that we have seen across the Scandinavian countries. And that is what we need to continue to reflect. So we need to redraw the game board, and I'm almost finished, Anita. We need to set up citizen funds to distribute the wealth of global commons equally. And that is a system that has been thought through here in Norway and is fundamental. We need to think about government measures. We need to look at the way in which government, with entrepreneurs, have that imagination to recreate wealth distribution. And we have a series of potential possibilities of how to do that. We even have 5 well-being governments that are now changing their national accounts and working away from GDP as the way in which to take into consideration economic development, not just growth. So we reduce social tension by 2030 if we take the giant leap. It is very clear the solutions are there. And we can achieve well-being in the future. The differential is amazing. And it doesn't take action that we don't already have in front of us today. It does not take solutions away that we don't already have today. The fact of the matter is that now we are confronted with the following theory of change. We must influence specific multilaterals. We must start to talk about this and change the narrative. It is a reality check, but there are possibilities, and Earth for All is feasible. We have to deliver national campaigns together. work on citizen assemblies and have these festivals to talk about what is possible and to think through together through a global conversation that we can actually save this planet that we call home. So the next step is to gather broad political support and economic transformation. And that economic transformation is a well-being economy. There are governments across the globe that are talking about shifting from GDP to putting in a real accounting system of what is most essential to people's lives and the way in which we can preserve the planet. And I'm going to leave you with this. And Anita, this is my last word, if I may, because I think it's so fundamental. As we get caught up in that rat race, as we worry about the world around us, let us remember to become human again. Let us remember our role within the ecosystem of so many other species and on this global planet. As Donella Meadows, the head author of The Limits to Growth, so astutely said in 1972, people don't need enormous cars. They need admiration and respect. They don't need a constant stream of new clothes. They need to feel that others consider them to be attractive. And they need excitement and variety and entertainment and beauty. People don't need electronic entertainment. They need something interesting to occupy their minds and emotions, and so forth. Trying to fill real but non-material needs for identity, community, self-esteem, challenge, love, joy with material things is to set up an unquenchable appetite for false solutions to never-satisfied longings. A society that allows itself to admit and articulate its non-material human needs and to find non-material ways to satisfy them would require much lower material and energy throughputs and would provide much higher levels of human well-being. Ladies and gentlemen, a well-being economy and an Earth for all is possible, but we need political will and we need the will of all of us to create it together. That takes both imagination and real guts to move forward and create the types of economies and political systems that we deserve, we as citizens. Thank you.
We have run over time, so we'll just take one question.
Sure.
Huh? Sandrine, you should run for office. So do we have any questions? Can we take one question? Eric, can we take? Many Europeans feel they are marginalized, much more now than 30 years ago. How do we get them on board?
Very good question. And that's exactly what this well-being campaign is all about, because actually we need to talk about the fact that people feel marginalized and disenfranchised. We had in Europe just 3 months ago in Brussels the largest Beyond Growth conference ever. The rooms were full. I've never seen so many people, all with new economists and politicians who are thinking together across all parties as to how we can create a Europe, a grand Marshall Plan that shows that citizens can thrive, not just survive. But we need to be concrete. Maybe two very key statistics that we need to think about. One, BP created the carbon accounting calculator in order to make citizens feel the responsibility of carbon accounting, okay? Let's be very clear. The responsibility of emissions right now is down to the fossil energy industry. We, as citizens, need to do what we can, but we have to call out those that are polluting the most and stop just thinking that actually we are going to get away with climate change without actually being very clear. That means we do need to reduce our dependency, but it means we need to call them out. Number two, CEO wages have increased by 1,000% since 1970. 1,000%. We also have to call that out and start to discuss the possibility of real wealth distribution.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much, Sandrine.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the world is divided over the war in Ukraine, over the war in Yemen, the relations between United States and China. You know, Chuck Hagel, who was the former American Defense Secretary in President Obama's administration, once said, "Foreign policy is a universe of bad decisions." Now, I don't know, but I think Hillary Clinton, who was in charge of foreign policy at that time, would have said that, oh yeah, right, and defense policy is a multiverse of disasters. So what can we expect from the ongoing geopolitical rivalries that we are seeing in the world today? C. Rajamohan is from the Asia Society Asia Society Institute in New Delhi, and he has written a book on China-India rivalry, and he will talk to us today now about bridging a fragmented world, a view from the East. Rajmohan.
Thank you, Anita, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here with all of you this afternoon. It's my first time here, and it's really a great pleasure and an opportunity for me to be with you and interact with you on the question of a fragmenting world and how do we bridge it. I don't think I can match Sandrine's eloquence, but what I can do is really to bring a different perspective from a different corner of the world. Hopefully, that's of some value for our deliberations this afternoon. What I thought I'll do is really to look at how we in the East look at the fragmentation that is going on. At least I talk about 3 trends of fragmentation. But there's also good news, which is really at least 2 trends of integration that are happening in the world today. So I'm also going to talk about them. And within that, what kind of a role can India play in bridging this divides and how we can actually integrate more in the days ahead. So the first question, I'm sure many of you really wonder why so many people in the East or the global South have not reacted the way you would have expected them to the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think there is a sense that, look, they don't care for this, they don't understand this. But what I would say is the first basic data point itself is that in the UN, most of the developing countries, East or the South, have voted with the resolutions calling for immediate Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. So I think there should be, there's a lot of misperception here. Most people have seen the consequences of this war. We feel the pain of the fragmentation in Europe. The idea that Europe can go through this kind of a brutal war certainly affects all of us. But I think part of the problem in the global South has been our sense of Soviet Union, which supported national liberation at a time when the Europeans were the colonial and the imperial powers. The lingering legacy of that is attached to Russia. For many of us, as we were beginning to fight European imperialism in the interwar period, Soviet Union and the United States were the only 2 countries that said liberation is necessary. So I think the attachment to Russia as a force for liberation remains deep across the political classes. So that's one part of the problem. And I think we're not sufficiently engaged with Europe to understand Russia's own imperial behavior historically within Europe. And I think we need a lot more dialogue there for us to get a better sense of European history, which we don't have. The second aspect is the fact that Europe and the West in general have largely taken the developing world for granted. We tell you what the rules are, just abide by them. There has been no political engagement after the end of the Cold War. And over the last 30 years, the sense that you really don't need them. But when you're suddenly in a war and you turn to them and say, guys, why aren't you raising your hand with us? So I think there are problems there. So I think what we need is really a lot more engagement between India and Europe on the issues of Ukraine, both in terms of its causes and consequences, as well as the effects of this on the global South. That is a big issue, and I think we need to talk about it a lot more. The second fragmenting force today is the deglobalization. For almost 30 years, we were told in Asia, look, guys, you've got to open up your markets, open up your economies. The only answer for growth is to open up and globalize and liberalize at home. So we've been very good students in Asia, learned this lesson rather well, and suddenly, now we are told, oh, sorry, you're exporting too much. You're creating unemployment in the developing world. So therefore, the rules are going to change. Just when we seem to be ready to be integrated into a globalized economy, we said, no, this is not going to work. Whether it is Europe's CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or the American sense that, look, you need to change the rules to stop either China or India, a whole lot of other countries that are exporting to the United States. So I think there are new rules. But I think I see, as a realist, that we got to deal with this problem, that the developing world, whatever the historical sequencing of this might have been, we cannot keep growing without a partnership with the West. So therefore, when we need to change the rules because globalization is not working for everyone. So how do we create a new set of rules? That is the challenge. And I think there again, we need to work together. Third, while we talk about fragmenting forces, there is a tendency now to frame the issues as North versus the South or the East versus the West. This, I think, completely misrepresents the conflicts within the East. There are as many internal divisions within the East and the South as there are today within the West, we see in the war in Ukraine. Those of you, I know Europe loves China. You've got a lot of business in China. But what we see is the problem in Europe of Russian aggression is not different from Xi Jinping's aggressive behavior in Asia. It's interesting, both of them have a lot of similarities. Both of them want more territory. I don't think these two large countries want more territory. But the fact that they have claims for territory of their neighbors, and the fact that they're equipped with nuclear weapons, therefore, we have the impunity to change borders by using force. The problem you face in Europe is exactly the problem India faces on its borders with China, or what Vietnam faces, what Philippines faces. So I think you've got to see this. It's not just Europe that's having a problem, that we also have problems in Asia. And I think the similarities are not often understood. So we see, well, why are the Indians silent on what's happening in Ukraine? We see the Europeans equally silent because you've got business interests in China. I mean, I understand the logic of the business interests, but I think here again, if we want a more integration, we need to talk to each other more. And that brings me to the two integrating factors that are unfolding. One is you're going to see more of Asia and Europe. And we are preparing to see even more of West in Europe. And I think this is something not intuitive. Consider, for example, in the Ukraine war, South Korea is selling arms to Poland that are being directed to Ukraine, South Korea. There was a time we used to complain, the Western arms merchants, they're going to sell arms, produce, prolonged conflicts in the developing world. Today, you have South Korea selling arms to Ukraine via Poland. You have Iran selling drones to Russia, which are being used with some effect in Ukraine. So what you have then is it's the old assumptions about what Asia is merely a passive actor, and that Asia has no agency. It's really the Europeans who set the rules for 400 years. I think that's fundamentally wrong. A risen Asia is going to influence outcomes in Europe. And I think we're just beginning to see the process. And far more consequential than what South Korea does, what Iran does, is the fact that China backs Russia. We thought European theater, the Asian theater were different. Today, the Sino-Russian alliance makes the two theaters into a single global complex. And I think we're already seeing, as more Asia comes into Europe, we're beginning to see NATO, Norway is a NATO member, and NATO coming into Asia. Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the leaders of these countries attended the last two NATO summits. I know the French have blocked setting up a NATO office in Tokyo, But the fact is, there is actually going to be a lot more integration because the problems, the security problems of Europe and Asia can no longer be separated. And what we're going to see is a much greater integration of this. So that brings me to the last point. Where does India come into this? Now, I believe that India can actually play and is poised to play a bridging role in many ways in the challenges that we face today. Today, thanks to the divisions within Asia, India has long believed in building a common Asia, an Asia in which India and China work together. To one way today, India is far more open to working with the West to build a new geopolitical order across the world. It's not just a question of being anti-China. There is a question of being anti-revisionism, a question of following basic rules of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think to get that, this is not just a European problem. As we said, this is an Asian problem in which Japan, India, Philippines, Vietnam, a whole range of countries are affected by territorial revisionism. So therefore, I think we have actually a bridging effect between Europe and Asia now that is possible. India is an active potential player in bridging this. Equally, on the North-South issues today, that today our leaders, today India talks about resurrecting the global South. But we're not going back to a non-aligned movement that framed the global issues as a conflict between developed and developing countries. But today, I think any solution that we need for climate change, we've heard so much about it in the previous speaker, to issues of food security, energy security, all these issues demand a cooperation between North and South. This cannot be solved as simply the responsibility of one side or the other. And here is where I think India can play this role as a bridging state between the North and South, besides being a bridging state, because hopefully India can help eventually contribute to negotiating some kind of a peaceful settlement in the current war in Europe. The other issue on which I think India will play a crucial role, in which all Norway and the Nordics should be interested, is in the energy transition. The previous speaker talked about, it's not just changing the human nature, but I don't think you can change human nature. We need technology. We need new forms of technology to alter the core of the climate change problem. What is the relationship between the nature of energy we use and the kind of economy we want to build? Therefore, we need technology, which good old Marx once said is the forces of production. We also need a change in the relations of production, which is what Sandrine was emphasizing. That is, how do classes relate to each other within a society? Because the moment you talk about climate change, the problem is finally about the costs of that, how those costs are distributed within nations and across nations. I think this requires, new ways of doing things, that is technology, as well as new ways of relating to each other. And I think there, India can play a crucial role. And I would just conclude with this thought, Anita, which is the Indian talent today is much sought after. We're seeing Indian talent, what it has done in the United States. And that for solving most of the problems in the world today, Indian talent at a time when Europe's population is declining. You need more Indians. So I'm not talking about immigration issue. We can talk about it in the question and answer. But the fact is, how do you bring the Indian talent to solve some of the problems of Europe and of the world? Thank you for your attention.
Well, we brought one Indian talent here, so that's one to go. Thank you so much. It was a beautifully structured speech, starting with all the forces of fragmentation and then the forces of integration. The way things are, has international geopolitics become a football game without referees and rules?
But it's always been the case, right? It's when we say good old Hobbes, who said, look, it's really, there's no supreme authority over states. But what we tried to do in the post-war world was to really create the United Nations, to create some set of rules, and hoping that those rules will manage an anarchic world. But I think we seem to be getting there. But what we saw, what Putin did in Europe, what Xi Jinping does in Asia, fundamentally, when the big boys violate rules, what do you do? How do you deal with those rules? And I think this is where new coalitions are needed to deter this kind of expansionism or the sense of nuclear impunity by those who own nuclear weapons and can change borders. So I think this requires, because without rules, the disaster, and we need more cooperation to get that done.
We have one question from the audience. How will India work towards reform of multilateral institutions, including the UN?
Look, I think UN is not the only way to go forward, because I don't see the Russians and the Chinese letting in, or the European Union, for example. Do you think they'll keep one seat and give the other two to somebody else? They won't. So I think let's be practical. I mean, I think the UN system is not going to be changed overnight. What we need is more like-minded coalitions. Whether it's climate change, because in the end, the idea that 180 countries can sit 3 nights without sleeping and can come up with solutions is gone. So I would say the major economies, like-minded countries, need to come together to devise a set of agreements between themselves, and then hoping that that example will create conditions for others to follow. So I would say the UN is jammed on security issues. WTO is jammed on economic issues. So I think we need some major economies to come together and some major polities to come together. Let's at least start agreeing on some rules, and then hope to campaign for those rules to be abided by others.
Best of luck to us. Thank you so much, Rajmohan. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Marina Saprikina. She is the head of the Center for CSR Development in Ukraine. She won the 2023 Nordic Business Forum Speaker Award, and she is an entrepreneur and a sustainability expert. She's also trying to help 10,000 women to start or restart their social business. Now, when we talk about war, we never think of businesses, but businesses create jobs, they put food on the table. So here is Marina talking to us on resilience and entrepreneurship in the time of war, what we can learn from the front lines of Ukraine. Marina, please welcome Marina, and please send in your questions on Minty. Marina.
Hi. As you may guess, I love latte, especially in the era of uncertainty. We all together live in the era of uncertainty, a chapter in the history that have such challenges that sometimes seem insurmountable. It all began with the COVID-19, a global disruption which shook the world. But then it took unprecedented turn, a full-fledged invasion against my homeland, Ukraine. And this is now the most brutal war in Europe since the Second World War. And this night, Russia launched 25 drones and rockets at peaceful Odessa. Our air defense system shot down all of them, but remnants damaged 200 buildings in Odessa, including 7 educational institutions. Sandrine has already shown you the global risk report from the World Economic Forum, and you can see that the upcoming decade will be defined by environmental and social risks, driven by geopolitical crises and risks and economic currents. So what businesses can do? In my opinion, businesses should be resilient. Even more, they should become extreme resilient, like Ukrainians and Ukrainian businesses. Because Ukrainian businesses, they raised the bar of extreme resilience to the highest level. They function now in an environment of minimum safety, of minimum security, of minimum stability, when every day is a day of uncertainty, when every night is a sleepless night. This May, Russia attacked us 18 nights in May. 18 sleepless nights. But even when we do not sleep up to 5 hours per night. I know that my favorite neighborhood coffee shop opens at 8 a.m. sharp, even in May, after 18 sleepless nights. Amid the last winter, when power outage plunges Ukraine in the total darkness due to relentless drone attacks and rocket attacks on our energy infrastructure, that cup of latte from that neighborhood coffee shop became my moment, my lifeline to normality. And 50% of Ukrainian energy infrastructure is ruined. But despite all this, with this morning latte, warmed up by generators, I understood how brave Ukrainian businesses are. And for me, it was a testament that light will prevail over darkness, good over evil, and Ukraine will win. Life is still difficult in Ukraine, and the scope of killing and destruction is staggering. And it's not just in Ukraine, it's globally, because Russia would like to make not only case not only in Ukraine, but globally, including agricultural crisis. And this is, for example, hotel attacked by Russia just several time ago. And it was the hotel where UN diplomats and internally displaced people used to stay. And now, currently, 8,000 civilians are killed, including 500 children, even more wounded. And also, we have environmental catastrophe. For example, after Kakhovka Dam explosion made by Russia, 70% of its water has been disappeared and posing a big threat to ecosystem in general, including Black Sea. 30% of Ukrainian forests are burned down. 30% of Ukrainian territories is mined. My country became the most mined country in the world, and it will take decades to demine it. And it's not just mere statistic, it's my pain, it's pain of many Ukrainians, and which I'm sharing with you. But also at the global level, Russia are constantly trying to deprive developing countries of our agriculture products, of our grain, of our oil, trying to cause famine in the world. And can you imagine how to do business under such realities? And how to start businesses? That's why it's a kind of audacious, but Ukraine needs businesses. Ukraine needs economy. And that's why, after 6 months of my stay in Vienna last time, I decided to come back with a special purpose. But during my time in Vienna, many people in Austria, in Poland, in Hungary, they helped me a lot. They gave me that cup of latte. And I know that the same happened here in Norway. And our unity is a very strong collective force. And as an Ukrainian, I would like to express my deep gratitude to you for your support to Ukraine. And thank you. Thank you to you. And I came back with a special purpose, to help Ukrainian women to start and restart their businesses. Because a lot of men are now at the front line, although 15% of women are there. But now, mostly women, they take care of all family members, and they need something to develop their welfare. So I decided to start Ukrainian Women Entrepreneurship Program. And yes, there is a plan to train 10,000 women. And now, in this August, there will be 1 year of this program. And we started from the scratch, but now we have already trained 500 women entrepreneurs who would like to start businesses now. And when I ask them about why they would like to do it, why they're so resilient, I would like to share with you their 3 characteristics. And first of all, they were able to overcome their fears. And you know that one of the most popular fears among 500 women entrepreneurs we trained is a fear of being rejected, of being alone, of not receiving support on their entrepreneurship journey. And in our community, we help them to overcome this fear. The second one is power of now. One woman entrepreneur wrote to me that the war changed her a lot, and she understood how precious the life is, and she wouldn't like to postpone her life now. And that's why she would like to start her business now, during the war. And you know that 63% of people in Ukraine would like to start their business in the times of war. One more fact. Last August, after full-fledged invasion, there were more businesses registered than 1 month before the full-fledged invasion. And every second business in Ukraine is registered by a woman. And number 3 is about values. After the full-fledged invasion, 1,000 companies left Russia. But there are still companies, international companies, who continue their work in Russia. They continue paying taxes, thus fueling the war in Ukraine and making it possible these atrocities against civilians. And also, and this is about values, although these companies are with very good sustainability policies. And the second thing, you know that now more and more businesses in Ukraine, they want to find their social purpose. And this is one of the most popular lectures now. And for Ukrainian companies, it's very, very important, because after the full-fledged invasion, many companies in Ukraine paid advanced taxes. Also, they continue supporting their employees, families, communities. They making pro bono projects for our army and for our government, especially in cybersecurity, for example. And also, number of volunteers, volunteering organizations increased by 8 times in Ukraine. And you know what? Ukraine is the only European country in the top 10 globally giving countries in the world, according to the last year survey. And also, we became happy according to World Happiness Index last year, because we help. And now we are currently looking for people who could share our values. And we are looking for social investors who could invest their 1,000 euro and help us to create more hubs in regions in Ukraine. Now we are looking for 60 brave social investors who could invest 1,000 euro and make 1-year program for our women, for 3,000 women in Chernihiv region. Chernihiv region was once occupied, but now liberated. And this is not just investment, it's a legacy. It's a kind of creating that timeless latte experience for Ukrainian women. It's a big support for their journey on being entrepreneurs. And I would like to wish you to stay resilient in this era of uncertainty, like Ukrainians.
That is beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Marina, for bringing Ukraine to Arendal. Thank you very much, and giving us this very personal viewpoint of what it's like to live there, work there, try to have a normal life, even be happy. We wish you all the very best. In case there are any questions, please send it very quickly to the audience. Marina, you mentioned about the kind of social things that the businesses were now trying to engage in. And one of your passions has been the support programs for veterans. What has been the response to that? Because when we look at it objectively, businesses have their hands full in a normal life cycle, but in a war situation, it is even more demanding. What has been the response to your pleas to them to kind of have more support programs for the veterans?
It's our reality. So a lot of businesses now, they try to integrate veterans into their operations, and they developed programs for this. And now we even have association of employers who work with veterans. So it's now growing and growing, and it will be a lot of veterans.
And you also mentioned in your research, one of the findings was that businesses tend to keep information confidential, information even like taxes, as you mentioned. And you're arguing that, no, you should reveal all these things, because if you want investment from the West, then you have to be transparent. What has been the response from the businesses?
I think there is a kind of pros and cons, because, for example, if it is a cybersecurity company, they can't disclose all numbers they invest in cybersecurity. It's logical. But mostly companies, for example, banks, they're very transparent, because we have very good national bank of Ukraine, and they show all their figures in terms of taxes paid, in terms of their programs, etc., etc. So you just mentioned one report we made. It was CSR, Sustainability in Times of War, and we worked with more than 30 companies, and we saw that companies not even stopped their sustainability. They increased their sustainability, their efforts, and I call it wartime sustainability.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marina, and wish you all the very best as you continue on your journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have to say one phrase, ha en god dag.
We will now move to our panel discussion on bridging a fragmented world. The law of civilization is cooperation. And as the foreign minister mentioned, it is like even in these dark times, we have examples of cooperation as in the high seas. So yes, the law of civilization is cooperation. And then there is the law of the jungle. We have all left the jungle, but the jungle hasn't always left us. And there we are today living in a very polarized world. So what are the consequences of this? Can we do something about this? We have an excellent panel to discuss this. And may I call on stage our panelists, Vidar Helgesen, who was a former Minister for Climate and Environment in Norway, and now the head of the Nobel Foundation in Stockholm. And then we have she needs no introduction, Sophie Högestøl, who is television commentator and as well as a professor of law. And we have Georg Rikeles, who is with the European Policy Center. I have to say this, I'm totally confused by Georg, because he's Norwegian. And there he is advising the European Commission on all kinds of sensitive, delicate, strategic matters like defense and security. And I'm thinking, when did Norway join the European Union? No, but it's the other way around. No, European Union has joined Norway, right? So there you go. So I want to start with you, Georg, because one of the biggest examples of fragmentation is Brexit. And you were with the European Commission, Michel Barnier's Brexit negotiating team. See what I mean? So there he was with the EU, helping them negotiate this. What were some of your takeaways from this entire negotiation experience in terms of our theme of fragmentation, causes, consequences?
Thank you, Anita. It's a pleasure to be here. If you allow me, also, if I could say a few words about what we've just heard, because I felt in the 4 speeches we've had, there's been a lot of passion, anger, justified anger, cause for concern and reflection, and also can-do attitude. And I think it's very much the case that in the world we're in today, we're seeing this slide away from a rules-based order to a power-based world with Ukraine, with China, US-China rivalry, and really heading to a world of confrontation. I would push it a little bit further, because you say the rule of civilization is cooperation. I think the default scenario we're heading into now is a non-cooperative world, really. And you can take many examples of that, but I think one very good example of that is climate change. Norwegians have felt it on their skin this summer, maybe for the first time realized it. But we are failing on climate change. We just have to realize it. If you go, I often like pulling out some old reports. There's one not that long ago, from 2 years back, by the International Energy Agency, which was called The Path to Net Zero. In short, the idea we can make it. And that report highlighted 4 things we need to do to avoid catastrophe. And that is carbon pricing, it's investments, technology, international cooperation. We're failing on all 4 fronts. It's only 30% of emissions today that have a carbon price on them, and only 4% that have a price that is consistent with meeting our 2030 targets. What we don't need is US IRA with the subsidy race, with protectionism. The Western world, or the most developed world, is burning far too much oil, and it's not going to stop doing it. And the poorer world is going to continue burning far too much
You're
coal.
absolutely right.
So it's really a moment of reckoning. And I think something that really struck me this spring was France, that decided that they were going to take as their default scenario for the preparation for climate change, not a 2-degree scenario or a 3-degree scenario, but a 4-degree warming scenario. As the first country in Europe, I think the first country in the world.
So others can follow suit, yeah.
Yeah,
But just going back to Brexit, tell me something quickly about Brexit.
Absolutely, but that France
look
we're
at him.
doing,
He's so
it's not giving up.
No more questions to you.
But it is realism on where we're heading. In terms of Brexit, what I could say is, well, I think Brexit is a very sad illustration of the linkages between internal fragmentation and external fragmentation, global fragmentation, societal fragmentation. And believe it or not, when we're negotiating Brexit with the UK, they did not want to negotiate future or discuss future cooperation with the EU on climate change. We had to drag them to the negotiation table on this. And of course, the causes of Brexit, they are many, they are complex. I believe very much in what Sandrine pointed to, one of the things she pointed to, which is social or societal tipping points.
Yeah, social risks, yes.
Social, societal tipping points. So of course, there's a lot of political entrepreneurship, charlatanism, I think the reasons of growing inequalities, austerity had a major role in this to play. There's a weight of history, of course. And so this should have been a real wake-up call for Europe, how one approaches politics, how one deals with populism. Brexit, to me, stands as an enormous loss, a loss, lose-lose-lose for everybody. But I think also what we're really seeing in this, and it's sad to say so, but it's also something Sandrine pointed to, it's a question of trust. And what we're seeing now in the UK society is the breakdown of, I would say, very much a social contract. Trust in institutions, that if you call an ambulance comes, that you have a proper prison system, that you can book a train, that infrastructure works. So I mean, there's a lot of dire lessons in Brexit for
Sophie,
Europe.
I mean, we were talking about populism, polarization, fake news, nationalism. These are all the things that fragment the world. And these are also words that we associate with Donald Trump. So if he comes to power, if he wins the 2024 elections, what do you expect will be the consequences on the world, and in particular, Russia's war in Ukraine?
From a Norwegian perspective, I think we then join the European Union, because I think Europe is going to have to reconsider its relationship to NATO at that point. I think, we know what Trump thinks about NATO, and I think it's going to bring forth another discussion about how we secure ourselves in a situation where the US is not reliable as a partner as we've grown up with. I think on a broader scale, what you're seeing in the US right now is that a lot of the Republican Party, which, again, if you sort of go back to a 2005 mentality, that would have been unexplainable. But a lot of the Republican Party are coalescing around an idea that what is happening in the Ukraine is a regional conflict for Europe, and that they're spending far too much money on it. And so they want to cut aid to Ukraine. They want to, Trump says in true Trump style that he could fix this scenario in 24 hours. I don't quite know what that would look like, but I'm guessing it's not a solution that Ukraine would favor. And so I think from a European perspective, that would be very destabilizing if he were to be re-elected. But I was reflecting this morning on, I lived 4 years in London from 2005 to 2009. And if you had told me at the time that Boris Johnson would one day be Prime Minister, the UK would leave the European Union, and the guy from The Apprentice would be President of the United States, I would not have believed any of it, right? So I think, it's like, I think especially, I'm born in the 80s. I think for a lot of us who grew up at that time, the world that we're living in right now is a world we have to grapple with, because it's one that we're still struggling to understand.
Yeah, very true. Vidar, you have repeatedly said a couple of things. I mean, Gerg was now talking about we feel the skin, on our skins, the effect of climate change. You have pointed out how the ground zero of climate change is the MENA area, the Middle East and North African area. And there is a lot of anger in these parts of the world, and some of it is against the Western hemisphere. What is your take on this? Why is there this extreme level of anger, and why is it that this is not being felt and experienced and understood by the rest of the world?
Well, to the last part, I think we're so consumed by, understandably, the Ukraine war, upcoming US elections, a lot of stuff, and here as well, impacts of climate change on us. But if we take the big picture, Europe's neighborhood to the south, North Africa and the Middle East, will be probably the region in the world most affected by climate change. We see that already. Drought, mega cities in North Africa that will experience in very concrete ways sea level rise in the next few decades. These are also areas that, to a large extent, 80-90 million people have water stress already. And this is a region with lots of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And if the Middle East, North Africa becomes unbearable, where are these people going next? Europe. And there's a rage because the West is seen as too consumed with itself. On the climate change negotiations, the West haven't delivered even those $100 billion, which is minuscule compared to what is needed. That was there in the Paris Agreement. COVID, the West was seen as giving priority to itself, so the rage was there. The rage is growing. And I think the West now really needs, while protecting the rule of law and the rules-based world order with regard to Ukraine, while protecting our own democracies, we also need to demonstrate that as democracies, we take responsibility for the rest of the world in a much bigger way, also because it's in our own interest.
One of the reasons for this fragmentation that we are seeing is the deficits in democracy in our part of the world. And so I want to check with you, Georg. Short answer, please, and don't answer something else. Big tech. First of all, big lobbies have always been a threat to democracy, and you have raised concerns about big tech and democracy. Can you tell us why?
I think many people have raised concerns about big tech and democracy and the outsized role big tech is taking in our societies, from the economy, dominating positions, to democracy, the roles platforms can play, to the invasion of privacy. And we live in very much what Susanne Schaboff called a surveillance capitalist model, where when you live in Norway, 300 data points are taken from your daily life every day on what you do, who you talk to, where you've been, what you read, etc., etc. And that is monetized by big companies. And I think the story of, well, if you say to take the US and Europe's approach to this, it's essentially been a story of failure and
failure of what?
Failure of regulation. Failure of regulation. Well, there was a dominating story at the beginning of tech in the 1990s, 2000s, which was that internet equals democracy. Silicon Valley is the model for the future. Social media, whatever comes out of it is good. Keep your hands off it. There's no need to regulate. And ultimately, that ideological paradigm has been very effective and won the day, and we have been very, very slow in catching up with this. And I think the consequences across society are absolutely enormous. But what I've been particularly interested in is not only all the negative consequences, but is how these companies, in addition to the effects they have on different walks and aspects of life, but also impact directly our decision-making and our capacity for democratic choices. And they, of course, they use all the tools in the toolbox. So it's not only the PR campaign and the lobbying and trying to set the narrative.
We saw it in Brexit, we saw it in the American elections.
But it's also buying academia, buying think tanks. I work in a think tank. It's buying NGOs. There's a lot of puppets out there, NGO puppets
research.
that are directly financed by big tech, trying to tell a different story than what's the reality. They use intimidation, all tools of influence. You have the Canadian Parliament now that's trying to pass a law saying that Google and Meta need to pay for some of the news snippets or news services they're using. And while they're doing this, they're facing enormous pushback from these companies. They've set down a parliamentary inquiry, the first in the world, which is on big tech's abusive practices and practices of intimidation, trying to reach into how our lawmaking is trying to make democratic choices. And the parallel I make, and I'll end with that, it's definitely with big tobacco. In big tobacco, 50s, 60s, 70s, there were warning signs. There were some scientific reports, but they were all pushed aside. You had President Reagan, who was doing advertising for tobacco. You had your local GP who was doing advertising for tobacco.
But you see, now we have the textbook. We have a textbook of what the tobacco lobby has done over decades. And now it subverted everything from the scientific findings to democracy. So now we have a playbook. And yes, please.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing is that it is just accelerating. Just this week, there's an initiative in the US to look at the use of AI videos in elections. You know, because creating fake videos now or fake audio has never been easier or more accessible. I mean, teenagers make fake TikTok videos of foreign artists singing in Norwegian, and that's a lot of fun to hear them singing in Norwegian. But they're, you know, that's the technology that you could also use to make similar videos of all of our world leaders. And the reason what they're looking at right now is that given that we have human rights protection for free speech that our societies are funded on, it is perfectly legal to lie during elections, right? And I think most of us would protect a certain right for politicians to at least skirmish a little bit with the truth. The only countries that have sort of fake news laws are countries like Russia. We don't want government agencies saying this is true, this is not true, this is true of campaign videos. But what is not legal is fraud, is putting out fraudulent messaging. And so they're trying to look at right now, is an AI video that's fake, is it just lying or is it fraudulent? And that just shows you how far behind the regulators are. Because the potential of that kind of videos I think, in the long term, I hope that we solve those problems, but from a short-term perspective, we have an election in 4 or 5 weeks, right? The US has had a presidential election coming up next year, and they're just looking at this now. And I think that really goes to show how far behind, especially lawyers, have been with trying to understand and grapple with tech, so that we can actually, because we see how much that kind of polarization and fake news feeds into destabilizing democracies and elections.
Yeah, but media is part of the problem, isn't it? Because the spread of disinformation, the spread of all these lies, and the problem is self-regulation doesn't work because the ratings depend on these lies and polarization and things like that. So how does one counter it from the media perspective? One is the technology, the regulation. What about the media, the responsibility that the media has in a democracy?
I think that's a really big question. I think the rise of 24-hour news cable is one of the worst things that have happened to political discourse in the 20th century. Because if you have 24 news channel hours, you have to create news content every single minute. There has to be breaking news all the time. So you can turn on CNN, it's like, breaking news. And it's never really, oftentimes not that breaking unless you're doing global events. So I do think that, but if the media wants to retain their position of trust, they have to be a part of solving this problem. And so I think I think you're seeing positive trends with certain media actors reconsidering their role. And you're actually seeing, from a Norwegian perspective, after COVID, a rise in trust of media actors, because I think a lot of people thought that they handled COVID quite well. So that's a hopeful message.
Yeah. Or we have to live on hope, what to do? There's no other choice. Vidar, globalization is in retreat, but so is democracy. Last year, 60% of the world was under authoritarian rule. This year, it is 72%, and it's just like climate change. It's like heading towards a tipping point. Can these trends be, as Sandrine was mentioning, democracy is sacred. We don't have to argue about why it is so important. We know it's important. So how do we counter this threat that has been developing over the last several years?
Well, I think it's first of all, I come back to what I said earlier. We need to support and ensure that Ukraine stops Russian aggression and retakes its borders. Because unless we have a rules-based international order, and unless the democracies of the West safeguard that principle, the rest of the world will become, or the world will become, a worse place. Then democracies need to demonstrate that they deliver, and that is a big challenge. We're seeing rising, Norway is kind of an exception, but we're seeing rising social and economic inequality. We're seeing, and here's Norway, Norway is not an exception on this, we see inaction on climate change. We see inaction on AI, which is really supercharging a lot of good stuff, but also a lot of bad stuff. So unless democracies, existing democracies, concentrate on their own ability to tackle these issues, I don't think we should preach to the rest of the world that you need to change. There's no way. We used to believe after the fall of the Berlin Wall that we could bring democracy to the rest of the world. Now the challenge is to safeguard democracy at home in Western countries.
Right.
And the next step after doing that job at home is to play a more constructive, more active role in the world. And I think Norway is in an exceptionally important position here. The rest of the world sees a country that over the last 2 years has had an extra unexpected income of $1,700 billion. So we really need to look at how do we deal with this image of Norway.
Vidar is so clever. He's a diplomat, right? So he uses the word surplus. Norway is a surplus nation. It's a surplus money, not war profits. Very smart, because that's how you'll get the buy-in to use that money to leverage it for the developing world. I want to ask you a question very briefly. This is a very, very brief round. We're running out of time very soon. So Vidar, on this, geopolitics is what fragments countries, the world. And now, as if the world didn't have enough problems, we've got rising tensions between China and the United States. Where do you see this headed? Can it lead to war?
Well, I think we should go to the prime expert on this, and that is Henry Kissinger, the 100-year-old man. He says that the US and China have both convinced themselves that the other country is a strategic threat, and therefore we are heading towards superpower confrontation. And he also says that the AI is supercharging this rivalry, because what's happening now to weapons technology is things that make it difficult to establish principles for governing and guiding the conduct of countries relating to war. So as long as sort of there's a dissipating ability to establish a global order. So yes, I think that's there's a real chance for confrontation. And the other big thing with that confrontation is insufficient collaboration between the US and China on climate change. They're trying to do something, but they should really do much more alongside the European
I love this panel. You know, they'll come back to what they love. You know, whatever question you ask, it'll be back to climate change.
But climate change is conflict. I mean, the future conflicts are also relating to climate change.
It shows that you see climate change as, you know, the thing that connects the dots, you know, so it's really good. I'm going to ask you a question, a short answer, and it is, what do you see as the impact of the US-China rivalry on Europe? And, you know, Europe was a market integration project. Can it become like a defense bloc?
I think Europe is falling in the crack between China and US right now. And there's a big unknown is how Europe is going to deal with China. I think Europe has shown, together with the US, that we can handle the Russian storm quite well. But if Russia is the geopolitical storm, China is geopolitical climate change. And I think I'm much more worried about our capacity to deal with this slow motion crisis that is building up and that Vidar just spoke about. This is really a fundamental challenge for Europe right now. Of course, one shouldn't lose hope, far from it, in the European project. I think really the moment the EU is in right now is a moment of transformation and of self-discovery. It's a project or a system that needs to go from a system that was about dealing with each other to a system that's about dealing with others. And that, in other words, the EU's discovery as some form of power, some form of geopolitical actor. And of course, that doesn't happen overnight, but we've seen it on the back of Russia's aggression of Ukraine. Great changes already. NATO is not delivering weapons to Ukraine. EU is delivering weapons to Ukraine. NATO is not doing it for good reasons, obviously. You don't want a NATO footprint. But the EU is sticking its neck out. When you had a debate about battle tanks, Leopards and Abrams and Challenger tanks to Ukraine, already then you had more than 260 ex-Soviet tanks delivered from Poland from Czech Republic to Ukraine. The bill for all those were all sent to the EU. There's a clearinghouse in the EU military staff that's organizing weapons deliveries. And of course, the brunt of the weapons deliveries comes from the UK, from the US, but also a lot of EU member states are doing a lot according to their relative capacities. And the EU is playing a role on this. The EU is doing training of soldiers, tens of thousands of soldiers for these spring and summer offensives. So you're really in the EU that is facing quite a rapid and an extraordinary transformation into some kind of parallel, but not a rival, but a parallel and complementary security actor to NATO. There are things that NATO can do. NATO is the bulwark against territorial aggression. There are other things that the EU is much better placed to do. And that's the role the EU should be playing.
We'll take on a question from the audience. How much of the conflicts in the world today comes down to cultural differences and lack of understanding of other cultures? Who will take that? Okay, please.
I think that's a really fascinating question. I've been thinking a lot about this time that we're in. I lived in Asia, in Singapore, for a long time as a child. And I think when I speak to some of the friends I still have in Singapore, they would tell me that this is growing pains for the West because power is returning where power belongs, and that is in Asia. You know, they're taking the long view of history, you know, in a 1,000-year perspective. You know, we were the powerful, you know, geopolitical center of the world, and power is slowly coming back to Asia. And that's painful if you're losing power relatively in a world where we're trying to dominate. But, you know, I kind of think there's something hopeful in what Raj was saying earlier about you know, how we're maybe entering a situation where Western countries are going to have to be a little bit more humble when they meet the rest of the world. because the system that we've had in place in the last 70 years hasn't necessarily been one that's been justice and equal for all. You know, when my students look at the UN, for example, they think it's baffling that India is in the Security Council. How can that be? What is the structure that has excluded, you know, such a big country from sitting at the world stage? And I think that, you know, from a European perspective, we have to go into the next decade or two looking at cooperation a little bit differently. You know, as Vida was saying, securing democracy at home, and then maybe being a little bit more humble when we meet other geopolitical actors and trying to understand their perspectives in a slightly different way than we have before. And that makes me a little hopeful.
Good, excellent. We have run out of time, but did you put your hand up?
To that question, I would like to point out that most conflicts relate to interests, hard-nosed interests.
Interesting.
But cultural differences and myths about cultural differences are obviously a very big part of the narrative that leaders use and abuse to wage war. And that abuse of cultural differences can also be used for other purposes than war, obviously.
Well, thank you, but we have run out of time. I have about 25 other questions to ask, but never mind. But thank you all so much. I just wanted to say that, you know, there's one thing that I observed, you know, we have been preparing for a long time, and what struck me was about the human brain. The human brain is fantastic, and our brain has 100 billion neurons. You know, neurons are these nerve cells inside the brain that send messages to different parts of our bodies and keep it functioning. So our brain has 100 billion neurons. Billion, not million, billion neurons. And that's as many stars as there are in the entire Milky Way galaxy of ours. And 1/3 of this powerful brain that we have is devoted to vision. So it is our capacity for vision, for imagination, that has brought humanity this far, and that will take us further. But imagination has to be a force for good. It has to be a force that bridges a fragmented world. It has to be a force that brings in a better future. As the philosopher Nicholas Risher said, the future really matters. It's in the future where we all are going to spend the rest of our lives. So imagine the future. The future is in your hands, is in our hands. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you so very much. Thank you. I haven't finished. Thank you so much for being here, for being part of Global Outlook's journey. Thank you very much to our wonderful speakers and panelists. Wish we had more time. There was so much brain power over here. Thank you so very much for firing our imagination, for giving us hope. And I just want to say a big thank you to the Global Outlook team. I would like to mention them by name. A big thank you to our team leader, Helena Flagmark, to Christine, to Anne, to Stina, to Ingun, to Lars, to Christoph. Thank you all so very much. It's been months and months of hard work, but it's been great being together and doing this. And a big word of thanks to Eric. Eric is our tech guru. You can't see him, but he can see you. And a big thank you to all our sponsors, IDA Cluster, GC Noda, GARD, Arendalsuka Company, and University of Agder. Thank you all very much. Thank you once again. Thank you all. And enjoy the rest of Arendalsuka. Thank you. Thank you. So little time.